Support for the Blueprint podcast comes from the SANS Institute. Ever since the debut of my Blue Team Fundamentals course in 2019, I've had students ask if there's a management-specific course that pairs with it. Well, the wait is finally over. If you like the topics covered in this podcast and would like to learn more about Blue Team leadership and management, check out my brand new 2-day course, Management 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. This new management track course is designed for SOC leaders looking to build, grow, or improve their security operations capabilities through improved analysis technique, false positive reduction, better metrics, and continuous SOC assessment. Don't think that just because this is a management course, it won't be hands-on. Throughout the 2 days, there are 6 hands-on labs that show you step-by-step how to use tools for organization and implementation of analyst playbooks, SOC use cases, threat intelligence, purple team assessment planning, and much, much more. Check out this new offering at sansurl.com/551. Hope to see you in class.
This is the Blueprint podcast, bringing you the latest in cyber defense and security operations from top Blue Team leaders. Blueprint is brought to you by the SANS Institute and is hosted by SANS certified instructor John Hubbard. And now, here's your host, John Hubbard.
On this episode of the Blueprint podcast, Roberto Rodriguez. Stay tuned as we talk about Blue Team data documentation, data quality. Blue Team moves towards standardization like Sigma and Jupyter notebooks, threat hunting, what data you need to be effective, how you should organize it, and lots more. Today on the Blueprint podcast. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I know you're a very busy person, so I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk to me for a minute.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. You're very happy to be here and looking forward to all the topics.
Sure. So first of all, to get us kind of kicked off here, can you give us just a quick background of how you got kind of into information security up to the point, what you're doing today and kind of jobs and projects you're working on?
Yeah. So I believe that I started a little bit different than a lot of people that I've talked to. Actually, I did not anticipate to be in cyber. Actually, I was doing a couple other things more related to computer networking, designing, and all this stuff. But that was the only major that was available actually in my community college. So I was like, all right, that sounds good. Let's just take a look at it. And then I started kind of like seeing that was a good next step. Well, okay, good first step to then move into cybersecurity. So I started doing my bachelor's on that. And I still was not convinced at all, like if this is, what I wanted to do. But something that I believe encouraged me to get into the field even more, and that started being, I believe, the way how now I do a lot of things in my career is actually the industry in general. When I started doing a lot of things like external events for cybersecurity, CTFs and all the stuff, I felt that there was not a community around it. Like I felt that there was a lot of people that were not as happy to collaborate as much and share as much information. So I started feeling a little bit that was the theme that I was kind of like experiencing at the beginning of my career. So I decided to, take the next step and say, you know what, I'm going to do this and just learn about all the different things that I believe will help me. Of course, I didn't have any direction into where I would go. So I started doing a lot of things in college, trying just to read a lot of books and understand what was going on with cyber. But that was at the beginning, kind of like feeling that, I wasn't fitting as much in the community. And I felt that was something that encouraged me just to, do some new things with that and try to learn as much as I could. Then I got the opportunity to do some help desk work. And there kind of like I started learning in Delaware, actually. In Delaware, I was, part of this company, that was helping a lot of different small businesses. And I decided to start getting a little bit more into talking to people about phishing, social engineering. Like that was the first thing that I just felt that would be a good conversation to have with CEOs and CISOs. So that helped me a lot to kind of like have that experience to talk to, C-level at a specific also technical level that everybody would understand. So that was a great practice to kind of like start showing why at least what I'm doing was valuable, right? Because that's hard. We can go all the way technical. Our career, the full length of our career can be technical, but sometimes understanding how you can express and show what you're doing and your value definitely helped me a lot. After that, I moved to another company where I started doing some incident response, some SOC analysts. The company name was DuPont in Delaware as well. And that was my first challenge because I was a team of 5 and I was just doing a lot of things with just 5 people with a big organization. So that was actually a great experience. Then I moved to Capital One, to the financial sector, where I started doing a lot of the things that I also do now, which is working with open source solutions and trying to see how those fit range. And that was a great experience because that was my first time that I was interacting with Jupyter Notebooks. And that's something that we'll be talking about in a little bit as well. And then after that, I decided to try consulting. I decided just to try to understand different companies. I didn't want to just stay in one place. So I figured why not just try to see what is out there and trying to apply similar methodologies and learn from other companies. That didn't last too long. The traveling was too much. For me, for some other consultants, it's good. But for me, it was not, what I was looking for to spend a couple of years in my career. So after that, I got an opportunity to work with AWS, actually. And I was doing more of the security engineering side for them. Working in a team, it was a very diverse team with data scientists, working in a few use cases and just using a lot of their services and all that. Finally, I decided to take another opportunity with Microsoft, and that's what I'm currently working on right now. So the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, and there pretty much what I do is just trying to get all these different open source projects that I've been working on and try to see how those actually fit into a lot of the things that we do. And also work on some new creative ideas to apply and also back to some of the other teams that we support as well, such as Azure Sentinel. But at the same time, I have a lot of the flexibility to do a lot of research also on the side from open source perspective. So that's pretty much, how I got all the way to where I am right now.
Very cool. So yeah, you've definitely seen it all, from large organizations to consulting, bouncing around, the travel thing, AWS, Microsoft, some of the biggest stuff out there. Very, very cool. With that perspective, obviously it's brought a lot of experience, and you mentioned open source tools and generating ideas. That's one of the things I always look to your blog and some of the projects you're doing for, because you have some really, really useful and deeply detailed sets of data you put out there for the community. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast. One of the things I often see when it comes to looking at various SOCs when I do consulting and things like that is just a lack of data and a lack of kind of data organization. And I think that's one of those things you like to look to address. When you were looking at, the average organization's kind of SOC, what are you looking for in a set of data in the logs? Like, what are the crucial steps you like the first questions you ask when you go into an environment to see what they have?
To me, one of the main first questions, and I think that something that I always, have the specific question where it's do you know your data? Do you know what you're collecting? And that question has, of course, I expect 2 answers, right? Kind of expect the answer first. So yeah, I'm collecting, Sysmon logs. I'm collecting PowerShell logs. I'm collecting security event logs. That's great. But do you know exactly what it is you're collecting? What configurations are implemented? What specific, audit categories you're actually enabling and collecting? Are you adding some additional enrichments, such as, for example, basic ones, enabling, command line for the creation of a process, things like that? Or are you adding another, for example, a couple of audit rules on the top of that data so you can enable more telemetry in your environment? So kind of first step to see how complete your data is based on the use cases that you are actually working with. For example, if you have a lot of intelligence around specific adversaries modifying a registry, okay, so what does that data look like for you in your collection strategy? So those are the first questions that I always ask, and it always ends up into creating a data wiki. Can we actually allow security analysts to have a data wiki where they could go back and see what it is that they can use in order to probably add more context to the queries that they're building? So those are the initial questions that I always ask to any organization that I work with. And you will be surprised that there's a lot of companies, doesn't matter if it's a small, mid-sized, or large organization, there is still, some of them are not doing it. And it's fine when you have a lot of people that have tons of experience in data, manipulating data, or just using data for queries. But when you start getting more people into your team and trying to expand your team overall to have other analysts interact with data, there is when you start having problems because they don't have the same expertise as you. So somehow there needs to be some documentation. So data documentation, data wiki for me is one of the first things that I definitely look into data for a SOC.
Yeah. And so when you say a data wiki, that's something that I rarely see also. What exactly do you mean when you say a data wiki? What does that kind of a system look like? What kind of data is in there? How would you interact with that? What would the average analyst be doing with such a thing?
So for me, a data wiki first starts with categorizing the specific I would say, events that you're collecting. For example, if I'm collecting Windows security event logs, at least that's already built in the categorization of how you can audit Windows security. So at least having some type of organization of the data so you can actually tell somebody if you're looking, for example, for anything related to process creation. Well, we can go to these specific sections of the wiki so we can have some organization of our event logs that we're collecting. If we go deeper, then there's when we start getting into what I call data dictionaries. It's actually a term that I learned when I was working at Capital One. So, data dictionaries would allow you to pretty much have a representation of the event itself, a sample of an event with the specific definitions of each field, specific data types, so you understand what types you're pretty much dealing with also when you query the data, all the way to a sample value. So you can actually see what the data might look like. You probably are returning a JSON file. Like a JSON representation of the data. So you have to have some information about the events that you're working with, and that's what I would add into a data wiki. Now, the way how a SOC analyst would interact with it, it's in a couple of stages. The first stage for me is more about understanding what it is that it's out there that we are collecting as an organization. Kind of like explore a little bit the different events that you can see. I've seen data wikis being hosted, for example, on GitHub repos, like private GitHub repos as markdown files, which is great. I have a project which has a markdown file that also has a YAML file, which allows you to programmatically also create some other representations of the data, but at the same time allows you to do some additional data analysis with other tools, because now you're dealing with a lot of events, something you can put into a table, and you can do some also data analysis into understand what event fields might be related to other events and things like that. So that's how I would see a data wiki kind of playing a role for a data analyst.
We'll be back after a quick break.
If you're enjoying this episode, then you're undoubtedly interested in building the strongest security operations team that you can. For those who want to go even deeper, did you know that SANS has not one, but 2 courses that cover security operations centers as well? For the leaders, managers, and directors out there, my co-author Mark Orlando and I offer 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. This course covers building your team, your physical and virtual workspace, getting the right data into your tools, and then focusing on security priorities through everyday execution of important security tasks and building the best SOC team possible. For the technical practitioners out there, my course Sec 450, Blue Team Fundamentals, Security Operations and Analysis is designed to cover everything you need to jump in being the best SOC analyst that you can be. We cover important data types, SOC tools, security logs, malware, analysis technique, automation, and much, much more. In addition, if you want to prove you can deliver the best on any security team, both courses have an accompanying certification available from GIAC. That's the GSOM for 551 and the GSOC for 450. Check out both courses and free demos available on the SANS website. You can get registered today for an in-person course at one of our many events, or go to On Demand and take either class anywhere at your own pace. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, very cool. So if you were making a SOC for the first time, is there any good resources? I know you mentioned one of your projects that has a lot of this already done. If you were making a brand new SOC trying to implement a data wiki and get the data for a data dictionary, that can obviously be an enormous task. So where would you start with that?
No, that's a great question. I actually had that question a lot when I was working as a consultant. And to me, it has a couple of different ways to do it. Like the way how I did it, for example, was to go through the data that I use in my lab environment. So every single Sysmon event log, I would just go, believe it or not, I would just go one by one. But at the same time, I would actually pull out the schema, using, Sysmon-S, which I believe is the flag. And then allows you to see at least the schema that you would expect for different events. So I started kind of looking into that. Then I moved into Windows security event logs, which is something that I was also very interested. But that was me getting interested on the data that I'm working with in my lab environment. When I get into an organization, you start pretty much seeing hundreds of different types of data sources that they are collecting, that are working with. So to me, the first thing that I would say is, what are the rules that you have created, detection rules that you have created so far in your environment? Oh, I'm creating these, 100 different rules in our environment. Okay, what are those rules mapped to? What data sources they are mapped to? And they say, oh, okay, so we're mapping it to 2 to 3 different data sources out of the 100 that we collect. Great, let's just start from there. Let's just start from the specific fields that you're using for your rules mapped to specific data sources. And that's like the beginning of trying to create a data wiki based on what you're already working on, because it's hard to tell somebody, go and document everything. Because the first thing is going to be, I don't have time. This is a full-time job. So to me, it's like, let's work with what you already have accomplished from a, detection rules or queries perspective. And then we can go from there and start documenting those specific fields in your event logs. The value of that at the end that I've seen is that a lot of rules are created based on specific fields for a specific event. But once they document the whole event, then they say, oh, there is actually a new field that I could actually join with this other field. Or there's this new field that I was not aware of. And that is actually great context for this detection rule. So I think that just by documenting the basics of what you already have, it has a ton of value to probably also improve the context that you get with the rules that you are already creating or working with.
For sure. Your OSEM project, that's one of the community contributions you put out there that has a lot of that information already documented, correct? And so that one, like, is that a good kind of universalizable, if that's the right word for that, source for that kind of data?
Yeah, I think that that's also something that I add always on conversations about this. When, some people might say, I don't have anything. Like, I have not done anything and I don't even have visibility to a couple of rules that I have. Okay, the OSEM project definitely grabs the schemas that you pretty much are kind of like familiarized with already. If you work with Sysmon events and you're working on some other projects such as, for example, Sigma project, which allows you to standardize your rules across different data sources and all that as well. But if you're familiar with those raw fields of all these security events that you're already working with, OSEM has all that already. So I was able to put together the initial data dictionaries for Sysmon. And then the amazing community, and I want to, give a shout out to, Nate Guenti from Subprime and also Ricardo Diaz as well. His handle is a little hard to say, but, both actually have done a ton of work to also help on adding events as well, to this repository. We do have also other people such as Ashwin Patel from Microsoft adding AWS data dictionaries. So that's a project that definitely is gathering a lot of those raw schemas. But at the same time, we do have some standardization on the top of it that we align with those data dictionaries. So we don't want to just replace the raw fields because we want this to be portable. But at the same time, we provide some of the standardization on a new column for each data dictionary. So yeah, the project would be a good start for somebody that wants to take something that it's already out there and it's being used by other projects already. So that's at least some type of validation that the project actually works. And the way how the project is structured, once again, with YAML files, for example, allows that integration with some other projects or integrations that you want to do in your organization as well.
Yeah, that's a big contribution for sure. Because of course, no one wants to, at least most of us are either unwilling or unable to sit around and like spend Friday night looking at Sysmon event schemas and stuff like that. So super glad that you guys have started putting all that together. Really cool stuff. So that's data standardization in terms of that. One of the other things I wanted to discuss was maybe analysis standardization would be the way I would put it, or analytics standardization. You mentioned Sigma and some of the other tools that you've been using for some of your other projects like Jupyter Notebooks. Yep. I'm super excited about this kind of a standardization coming to the Blue Team. I think it's one of those things we've needed for a really, really long time because, there's everyone out there with their own separate environment and data field names and tools and everything they're using. And so it seems like this is really bringing stuff in the right direction. What are you seeing in terms of kind of pickup for these kind of, efforts in the community, Sigma and Jupyter Notebooks? Are you seeing those start to take hold?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, so first I'll speak about the standardization piece. So there is, two kind of, in my opinion, the way how I see it with these projects is like two types of standardization, let's say. So the first one, like you mentioned, is more about, how you, name your field so you can actually run a query across, diverse data sets. The way how Sigma is approaching this, and it has some of that also once it does some of the transformation of Sigma rules to other formats. But the initial concept for Sigma, right, it's just to have one rule format that could be translated to other rule formats. So the sharing and collaboration is great. And of course, it keeps the raw fields for a lot of their rules. But also Sigma is working on having for example, like a process creation rules, which will touch, Sysmon 1, event ID 1, and then security event 4688. So they're also doing that type of standardization. And I believe that some of the initial conversation was to potentially use something similar to OSEM, which we can provide some of the work already done, where we provide standardization concepts or fields for each specific event. So probably Sigma can do some of that as well, integrate OSIM standardizations with however they want to do also the standard rules to touch more than one specific event provider, in this case, Sysmon and security. So I see that actually taking place in a lot of organizations as well, where they see the value of Sigma, but now how can I actually start using that in production and take a Sigma rule and then pretty much touch every single data source where, let's say, a process exists, an IP exists, a file exists. So that's what I'm seeing already for some companies that I've been talking to as well. It's amazing because you're pretty much integrating, if your company wants to rename field A to field X, you can apply that as standardization to the translation of a Sigma rule to your own format, and you will be able to, do that. You'll be able to pretty much start creating rules, for your own standardization and format as well. So that's what I'm seeing, taking off, great project. Something that I'm also seeing from a Jupyter Notebook perspective is Jupyter Notebooks have been out there for years, not hundreds of years, 20 years, but at least it's been, if I'm not mistaken, the first Jupyter Notebook project was in 2014 or 11. I did a presentation about it. I forgot specifically.
Yeah, it's been out there a while.
Yeah, so it's interesting because that project is being used by other communities as well, such as, for example, the data science community in general. They use it for pretty much a lot of the processes that they use to analyze the data, transform it, and all that. So from our community, I think that I'm seeing people understanding the value that it brings to your analysis. So pretty much one of them would be the flexibility to actually import any library that you might create to use, for example, analysis of data. So you can pretty much enrich your analysis itself just by bringing your own tools on the top of, Jupyter Notebook. So I think that people are seeing that. There is a new tool called Mystic Pi also from Microsoft. And the reason why I mentioned this one, not because it's Microsoft, but it's open source. So it's an open source Python library that allows you to do this additional data analysis on the top of the data that you collect as well. So I'm seeing that pattern more and more where people are sharing things that work for them and how they can apply it to a Jupyter Notebook, which is standardized a little bit the way how you analyze data. I believe that for years we have been locked into the way how we analyze data is actually determined by the commercial tool that you buy, right? And that's great. I mean, don't take me wrong. There's some great tools out there that allows you to analyze the data. But one thing that I was actually, mentioning and talking with my wife the other day is that we're all not the same. We're not the same analysts that apply the same techniques to analyze the data. So I want to have the freedom and flexibility to do more and enrich pretty much what I already get from a commercial tool. Jupyter Notebooks, to me, is the best open source project to do that, where you can add additional capabilities. Let's just be clear. I will never say let's replace everything with Jupyter Notebooks. Jupyter Notebooks is a great complement to what data analysts do already with commercial tools. So that's what I'm seeing also, even SIMs already integrating Jupyter Notebooks, with their own technology. I started working with a health project and people didn't know that there was already a connector to start, connecting specific, I would say, Spark queries or just distributed data computation with, for example, the health. That was, something that was not actually public for cybersecurity. But I'm seeing now other SIMs already taking off and just providing Jupyter Notebooks, and it's just been amazing.
Yeah, there's some really, really cool stuff coming down the pipe, I think. And like you said, standardization, when it comes to that, I think that's one thing that's really going to break the blue team loose and kind of free us from having our data stuck in whatever format or analysis path that your tool has kind of dictated for you. And if everyone can use the same, analytics or analysis style, and we have a standard set of data, then, it doesn't matter who discovers how to identify some attack technique in the future, then, ideally in some soon to be future state, we can all just kind of apply that and go from there, which is something we've never been able to do in the past. So every time I'm seeing this Jupyter Notebook stuff, it's mind blowing. I'm now we can talk about standardized data, standardized attack techniques with, the attack matrix, standardized analytics with Sigma, and even standardized analysis methods. And when the world has decided on standards for all of that stuff, I think cyber defense is going to be a whole different game, and things hopefully will become way more difficult for attackers. One of the things you mentioned, so Helk, right? A platform that you created to kind of facilitate a lot of this type of interaction. It has some tools in there that I think a lot of blue teams may not be familiar with. There's Apache Spark, as you mentioned, and it brings in Hadoop and Kafka and all that. What kind of extra capability, like why did you bring those things in? What is that bringing to the table in terms of an analysis technique?
Yep, that's a great question. I think that, so everything, I'm going to start with a little story with Helk. So Helk, when I started working for Capital One, they were using, of course, an Elk stack before. I was talking about years ago. And there was also data scientists that wanted to interact with the data. So a lot of the conversations were, can I get the data in this other format so I can pretty much analyze it with my notebooks infrastructure? And that was the conversation all the time. There was always this big disconnection also from how some other people are analyzing data and what, for example, SOC analysts or just in general, data analysts were doing for cybersecurity. So I started looking at that pattern that there was a big disconnection. So I just started thinking about there must be a way to integrate, for example, an Elk stack with the Jupyter Notebook. That was actually the beginning of these conversations. And I had already seen actually, David Bianco from Target doing some of that with some, Python libraries. But I wanted to build something that was similar to what you will see at scale in an organization that has tons of data, which at the end would be implementing some, distributed computation. So data stored in more than one server. So when you query that, you want to hit all the servers that contain that data. That's what it's called, distributed. So I wanted to build something similar. So I started learning a little bit about Elk stacks and then Jupyter Notebooks. And then I saw that there was a connection to do actually with a library called ES Hadoop. And that library pretty much allows that type of communication, like distributed computation with an Elasticsearch database. So I started kind of doing some research into what it is that I could do with this ES Hadoop, ES Hadoop library that is part of the Elastic, products, kind of open source, product or just open products. And I found out that I could actually use Apache Spark. And Apache Spark is basically just I would say, what they call a unified engine, computational engine. So Apache Spark does not store data as a main database. It actually allows you to query data. It might store the data it does store data, I would say, in memory for a short period of time. But once it's done, it just releases, of course, the contents from memory. But it's a computational engine that allows you to first just run some basic queries. It uses actually Spark SQL, which basically is just SQL-like queries. It gets the data, puts it in a format in what is called a data frame format. It's a table format. And then you can use Spark SQL to start analyzing that data. So it can grab a lot of the, I would say, disparate data sets, disparate formats, and you can grab it with Apache Spark through the ES Hadoop library and then push it to a Jupyter Notebook where you can do some additional analysis. So that was like the initial pipe. And of course, Apache Spark is not just only for SQL-like queries. It has other libraries on the top, which allows you to do, for example, some structured streaming. So you can grab actually data in a structured format as a table and then apply some rules or queries in real time. So you can do some batch queries on the top of the data coming from your Elasticsearch or any other database where you're using Apache Spark. So I started to play with that. I wanted to see what that actually would look like because I was hearing all these use cases in the company that I was working for. So I was like, why can't I do the same thing at home? And of course, for free. Like I want to do something for free and test it at home. So there's what Helk started to take form, where all these pieces started actually to make sense. Apache Spark also comes with libraries, to do machine learning. I'm not at that level yet. That's actually one of the places where I want to explore and get to. But at least I have the pipe that would allow me to connect Apache Spark or Jupyter Notebooks with any other infrastructure. In this case, I just chose the Elk stack because it was the easiest thing at that moment to deploy and work with. But then at the end, I started thinking, what else can I add to this build that reflects a similar real environment? And that is when I started looking into, for example, things like Kafka. Kafka is just a server that allows, I would say, other technologies to ship data to it. So you can push data to Kafka, but at the same time, you can consume the data from Kafka. So Kafka does not take the data and sends it somewhere else. It's just stationary server that you can put in the front of your pipe. And that has a lot of other benefits. One of them could be, like if your database goes down, of course, your Kafka server is there holding your data for a week or 2 weeks. I've seen those implementations at scale. So I was thinking that would be awesome to work with some of that. But at the same time, I didn't just want to throw a technology out there in the project and just say, just because I've seen it somewhere else. I was looking for other ways to actually analyze my data before it hits the main database and before it even hits my Jupyter Notebook or PySpark implementation or Apache Spark implementation. So I started playing with Kafka and I found out that they have something called KSQL. So KSQL is another application on the top of Kafka that allows you to consume the data directly from the Kafka server, do some analysis, some SQL queries, and then send the data back to your Kafka broker. So at the end of the day, your data can flow through your Kafka servers, but at the same time, you can have it as enriched in a different place on the server. So those type of use cases is what I was experiencing a lot throughout my career into seeing different companies applying some of these use cases and topics. So I decided to implement it in Helk, and that's why the whole project started to pretty much like be built. And then without even thinking or noticing in the beginning, but then a lot of people started paying attention to the project. And there is when I was like, oh, snap, this is going to turn into something that I have to maintain my whole life. But at the end of the day, I think that also the amazing community, once again, Nate Guenti from Subprime as well, like he decided to say, hey, I have experience with some of this infrastructure and I would love to help. And now Nate also is one of the main contributors to the project. Great collaboration with them and contributions. So it's amazing to see projects like this actually taking off and seeing other people contributing. But that's the whole Helk idea and some of the additional tools that you get with Helk and some of the additional topics that you do not get directly with a regular SIM infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely like a really cool project that I've tried to follow over the years as well. And that's one of those things, I hear a lot of people say like, oh, they get wrapped up in perfection and complete data and all of that stuff. One thing I wanted to ask about this is, do you think that level of, I don't want to say complexity, but that many different tools and different views on data is something that's necessary for catching the majority of attacks? Or like, what kind of things, like, is that enabling you to do a ton of stuff that you otherwise couldn't do and need to do every day? Or is that like catching the last like 1% of really advanced attacks?
No, that's a great question. I think that, so it depends what I would say in this case, what SIM you're working with or what tools you're working with, in addition to the other tools that are integrated, such as Apache Spark, Jupyter Notebooks, and all this stuff. I think that it depends. For example, with certain technologies, I was actually so constrained to a basic language to query my data. So having a Jupyter Notebook and Apache Spark integration allow me to extend my capabilities from a data analysis perspective. So I was able to do, for example, some basic stuff such as join queries, but efficiently. And that's something also that I like to talk about. Even if your current SIM or technology does have join capabilities, it does not mean that it will be at the end efficient for you to run a query. It might break sometimes, like your backend, like it's not designed to handle that amount of data at scale. So those type of use cases, when I started getting into, for example, understanding the concepts of Apache Spark, which is very complex. We can pretty much talk about that in a whole new episode of a podcast. But just to summarize, it actually has a lot of features that allows to, I would say, take the query that you want to run on a specific database or data store and allows you to run the query efficiently. It creates a plan that allows you to see what's the best way to run this query and then, be like memory efficient and all those things, right? So I started looking into some of these use cases to help me to make a lot of the use cases that I was working with to make them possible. Like, I really want to work with technology that would allow me to do things and that I know it's validated and proved to work at scale with a lot of organizations. So those are one of the use cases. It allowed me to extend the capabilities that I was having with certain tools. That's why Helk also had it, because it extended a lot of those things. At the same time, I believe that it opens the door to additional integrations. For example, there's a lot of technologies that I think that the pattern that I'm seeing as well is that a lot of technologies that there are, such as data analytic platforms or SIMs, for example, some of them are they're taking a modular approach where they can now integrate with other services. And I think that that's kind of like the initial thought with Helk. How can I take something and then extend it to start seeing, for example, there's use cases where I'm analyzing data, for example, just with a couple of, SQL joins or nested joins. At the end of the day, it's not going to be efficient, to do. But how can you translate that way of analysis to something else that might be a little bit more efficient? So there's when we start getting into, for example, graphing, right? Where graphing, if you start thinking about graph analysis, the basics of that is pretty much a bunch of joins, right? There's a lot of joins going on to connect all these different nodes and specific edges, depending on what you want to do. So when you start getting into those use cases, then you need infrastructure that would allow you to integrate it, directly. And for example, Jupyter Notebooks integrates very well with, Neo4j databases, and even Apache Spark has its own graph libraries. So to kind of like finish the answer in there, it's like there is a lot of different capabilities that all these tools have enabled, for me to do some additional, more creative ways to do data analysis. I don't want to get stuck with just the basic SQL stuff or just basic SQL joins. I want to know what it is that I could do more to be more efficient. And that expands other use cases as well that allows me to think about how can I approach a detection with this new technology. Like graphing has some great capabilities. You do not have to use graphing for everything, right? Because some people think that they can just replace everything with graph, but at least graphing allows some additional capabilities on your data analysis perspective.
Yeah. So all of these tools, very, very exciting stuff, things I think are absolutely the future edge of blue teaming. People who are wanting to get into this stuff after we've talked about this, maybe we've said a lot of tools in terms that, some of the listeners might not know enough about. Where's a good resource to go to kind of get started down this path of learning about Jupyter Notebooks or Apache Spark? Do you have any good resources for that?
Yeah. So there is one. Well, the first thing I would say is there is a GitHub repository. Well, two GitHub repositories, and I'll explain why. So there is two GitHub organizations. They're public, they're company agnostic, and they all have these projects that I've been talking about, specifically Helg, Mordor, and Hunter Playbook, other projects. The links is pretty much Hunters-Forge, and that's pretty much the GitHub organization, Hunters Forge. And then there is another organization, and it's called OTRF. So O-T-R as Roberto, F as Frank, OTRF, T as Tom. So OTRF, GitHub organization. And that's like the evolution of Hunters Forge. And it's actually an initiative that I'm running as well, hopefully releasing soon, which is going to have more than just GitHub repositories. It's going to be having a lot of different things like events and things like that. It's kind of building a community around open source projects. But so far, those projects are pretty much spread on those two organizations. And at the end, it's going to be, of course, everything moved to OTRF. But you can see all those projects in there. The other thing also, I believe we can share the link at the end of the podcast. It's going to be a link for a Slack channel that is pretty much where I created first to be private because I didn't know how to make it public. That was funny because people were like, hey, how can you make this public? I was like, I don't know, man. I was like, I don't know how to do this, how to do automated invitations. I'm sorry. Just tell me if you want to join and I'll send you an invite. But now it's, anybody can join. And there is a lot of conversations. We do have channels around data sources, around health, channels around, for example, specific detection for specific platforms. So there is a lot of people there that are willing to share their knowledge. And with this recent event, as part of the OTRF movement, community movement, we also talk about Jupyter Notebooks in this event called Jupyter-thon that happened a couple of weeks ago. And people that joined that event joined the Slack channel. And now we do have conversations about Jupyter Notebooks more than ever before. I think that I was one of the only ones there that wanted to talk about it, and not too many people were interested. And I understood. And now there's people asking about notebooks. And I think that that's kind of like the best way to also feel free to ask questions and all the stuff. So GitHub organizations and a Slack will be the best, I would say, ways to start learning about these resources in general.
Very cool. Yeah. So we'll definitely get those links and put them in the show notes so everyone can find those. That's a ton of information, a bunch of really great stuff. Where can we find additional information on what you're doing online, what projects, and what you're up to?
Oh, yeah. Yep. So you guys can follow me on Twitter. I think that everything that I do, it just gets posted on my Twitter account. So it's at Cyber War Dog, so capital C and capital W. And instead of the 3, E is a 3, and instead of the word dog, O is a 0. It's just, I don't know why. I created that account a long time ago, and I'm like, great, this is going to be my account now.
Looks awesome, hard to spell. Yeah.
Yeah. So Cyber War Dog is where everything that I do is share it and tweet it every time I release something. So that would be the easiest way. And of course, all these public organizations, I would say that probably 95% of the projects there are projects that I continue to support and I have worked on and authored. So there are also all the things that I'm putting together every single new repo is going to be on the OTR Rev 1, of course, since it's the one that we're pushing soon. Yeah, but those are the resources. I think that's the best way to contact me. And then also Slack. And then we have also Medium, but that's everything in Slack as well. We have some links in there. And we can share the Medium blog link as well at the end of the podcast, so you guys can see all the blog posts that I have put together that are part already of the Open Thread research community, which, by the way, I kept saying OTR, but I didn't say what it was. But OTR, it means Open Thread Research. That's pretty much the idea behind, is to bring other researchers to talk about their research, specifically when it comes down to threats. And of course, we wanted to keep it open because we didn't want to just focus on detection of threats, but at the same time talk to other people that are working on projects that would allow us to emulate adversaries, so emulate those threats and then move to the detection steps. So Open Threat Research is very inclusive to all the different fields in cybersecurity, and it's pretty much where everything will be being shown, like as a one-stop shop, like one hub. Yep.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Roberto, for being on the podcast. We got tons of good resources and links for people to follow here, so we'll make sure to get all those in the notes. For all the listeners, I highly recommend you check out everything Roberto's doing. He's, like I said, on the forefront of what I think is going to be the future of blue teaming. A bunch of really cool data sources, projects, open source information, really in-depth blog with examples and all that good stuff. So thank you, Roberto, for all that you do for the community. And thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much, guys. Take care.
Hey Blue Teamers, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Blueprint. If you've got a second and want to help support the podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It would be really, really meaningful to us. And if you have any ideas or suggestions, I would love to hear them. Your reviews are going to be one of the best ways to help others find this podcast, so anything you could do would be a big help. As always, thank you for listening. You can connect to me on social at SecHub, SecHubb on Twitter or on LinkedIn. So until next time, thank you for listening to the Blueprint Podcast.